Clear prop.
Star 738, Cherokee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I am fantastic as always. This week we're tackling a topic that I'm sure we've sprinkled in all over a bunch of other podcasts, but based on some recent incidents and things that Wally's seen on check rides, we're going to talk about recognizing systems problems. And we're not just going to hone in on an electrical failure or other things that we've probably done shows on in the past, but some recent training that I've done in preparation for my next check ride and other things. I've recognized some of my own weaknesses and not recognizing things in the cockpit that I should have recognized. And we're going to break it all down and hopefully tell you how to be a better pilot, be better prepared, and instructors that are listening, maybe better ways to teach and practice with your students so that when they see Wally and have a issue or a simulated issue, they'll do a much better job of recognizing system failures. Now, we talk a lot about fuel, we talk a lot about electricity, but there's a million little things that could go wrong. So much so that some Post-it notes have kicked my butt lately, Wally. It's almost embarrassing to share some of the things I'm going to share, but as not flying in real IMC or really instrument conditions in the last couple of years, I decided I wanted to get really current, get really smart again, get back to flying regularly and feel confident flying in IMC. And so I started an instrument proficiency check with some instructors, and man, when they covered up the airspeed tape, I was flabbergasted on and then they covered up the altitude, and I was flabbergasted. And I recognized obviously what the problem was, but I was stumped on how I was going to figure this information out. So much so that I literally just blanked out on the standby instruments and mad at myself. And I think the CFI thought I was kidding, but I think I was so fixated on what was on those screens that I had forgot that those should have been part of my scan just because it's been a few years since I've really trained. I'm sure you've seen people make bigger mistakes than that, but what are your thoughts when I tell you I forgot about the standby instruments? That could be deadly.
Yeah, it could be, but I can see it happening. What I have come to find out just here recently, I've asked a lot of, first of all, the airplane is a horrible classroom. So we end up teaching a lot in a briefing room. And, we have a nice whiteboard probably there. The lighting is good. The sound is good. And it's much more conducive to communicate with each other. And I think a lot of instructors sit in a briefing room and they talk about a lot of this theoretical stuff. What would you do if this happened? Well, I would do this and go over here, and I would do this, and then I would do that. Okay, well, what about this? Well, we would do this too. Okay, great. All right, now they move on to the next thing. And I think the thing that we don't do a good job of is now taking that, maybe that scenario, and then actually going out and doing it in an airplane in a less, in an environment that's less conducive to easy communication. And you can do some of it in a simulator, and there are certain things, for instance, a vacuum pump failure. I mean, how do we simulate a vacuum pump in an airplane? Well, we take suction cups and we stick over the attitude indicator and the heading indicator. Well, that's not very realistic, because if you have a vacuum pump failure, it's going to be a slow failure, and just recognizing it is a big deal. So that's a scenario where a simulator is like liquid gold. Learning what a vacuum pump failure actually looks like and how you would manage it. And it's easy not to look at an attitude indicator and a heading indicator when there's a suction cup stuck on top of it. It tells you, hey, I'm no good. But when it's in front of you and it's bad information, but it looks like it's good information, man, it's hard. It's not hard not to look at that because you've been taught, you've heard your instructor say, attitude, attitude, attitude. Look at that, Well, now you can't do that. So, there's one scenario where, again, the simulator is just worth its weight in gold. It really is.
No question. And while I was experiencing this partial panel experience with my flight instructor, I think it was one of those times where I was just so frustrated that I lost so much skills compared to where I was at. But then again, it was the lack of recognition on how to solve it, because there was other ways to solve it, right? I could move my primary flight display to my MFD. I could look at the standby instruments. I could change some of the navigational information that was at the top of the G1000 to get some of that information. And thank goodness this was a simulated experience, but had it been a real world experience in IMC, I don't know where my mind would have gone once I started compounding. Like, I don't know how to get on the ground without altitude, and I'm not looking at the other altimeter. I don't know what I'm going to do about airspeed. Just keep going fast, but until I can see it. And so hopefully those instruments would have been made available to me at some point, or I would have thought of them. But there's a lot of little things in my own training that I'm glad I'm experiencing because they're making me a better pilot. But even autopilot functions, a lot of the procedural stuff is what I've lost over the last couple of years, of course. I can read a plate and kind of know what I'm supposed to do on the majority of them. But when autopilot isn't in approach mode and you don't command it to be in approach mode, but you know the autopilot's on, that can confuse the heck out of somebody who doesn't fly that often.
Yeah.
And you could go to the wrong thing. Not activating a flight plan. A lot of the stuff that I'm preparing for is the type rating that's coming up. And I don't think they're going to give me much leeway in a jet to make some big mistakes like that. So hopefully I'm sharpening the edge of my game and getting much better. But autopilot, depending on the glass information, not knowing how to use standby instruments, all those things could add up to a lot of really bad stuff. I think what you're talking about is things we've discussed where, what does it sound like when the intercom stops working? Who knows really what that's like, and are we demonstrating it? And if you're timid to do that in the air, you can do that on the ramp, right? It happens every time probably. You start the plane, if you don't turn the avionics switch on, it's just like having an intercom broken and you got to sit there and scream at each other for a little bit. That could all be simulated and demonstrated on the ground for sure. And my instructor turned the master switch off in flight, and we flew for probably 10 minutes and yelled at each other and realized what that felt like. Be very careful if you're under a Bravo shelf or where ADSB is required. That could cause you issues. But on the ground, I think you should demonstrate that as a flight instructor. I think there's a lot of things flight instructors can do to create some stress and recognizing failures that maybe aren't in the syllabus or aren't really advertised that we could share with them. While you've had a couple of check rides where things haven't gone well, what do you think pilots should do or investigate? Maybe not believe all the hearsay. What kind of tips do you have based on some recent activities?
Well, back in the day when I was a 727 instructor at my airline, one of the performance problems I used to always give to all my check ride people coming in for their annual check ride was a wind shear performance problem. And I found out through the grapevine that I had a nickname out on the line, and my nickname was Wind Shear Wally. And, I kind of like that kind of affectionately. I'm thinking, okay, so that means that everybody coming to me for a check ride is boning up on performance data for a takeoff and a potential wind shear. And I'm thinking, well, so we're better pilots now. I think nowadays doing general aviation check rides, if I had a nickname, and I haven't heard anybody say this, but I think it would be electrical system Wally. The two big systems, we have to cover three systems on a check ride, But I guarantee every single one of my check rides, we're going to cover the engine and we're going to cover the electrical system. And then we're going to cover something else. And that other something else kind of rotates. But I think the two most important systems in these airplanes, and again, we're talking about, single-engine trainer-type airplanes, the two most important systems are the engine and the electrical system. And I've just found that a lot of people, they can talk about the theory of the electrical system, but when it comes down to maybe actually applying it, we have some issues. And we had a recent accident here locally just a few weeks ago, and they think that kind of contributed to things, that there was confusion, and I don't want to speculate, but confusion as to what was really going to happen with an electrical system failure. So let's talk about an electrical system. Let's just make it real. Let's dummy it down and say we've got a battery, we've got an alternator, and we've got the components, the things, the radios, the lights, whatever. All right, there's a little bit more to it than that, but let's just call it those three things. So the alternator is basically a battery charger. So if we have an alternator failure, do we have an electrical system failure? No, we don't. Not yet. Maybe somewhere down the road we will, but now it's just like operating your cell phone without it being plugged in. It works just fine. It's eventually that battery's going to die, but right now it's just fine. I would venture to say if we looked in most POHs for small airplanes, most of them will not have an alternator failure checklist. I actually looked at my Saratoga 2 days ago, and I actually do have an alternator failure checklist in that particular airplane. But most airplanes will not have a checklist called alternator failure. So we sit in a briefing room and we talk about alternator failures, pull out a checklist. Well, now we look for a checklist. We don't have an alternator failure checklist. Most of the time, what we have is a checklist that says something to the effect of low voltage. And why would an alternator failure cause low voltage? Well, if the airplane has a 24-volt electrical system, and you can change 24 to 12, it doesn't matter. Most Pipers are 12-volt. Cessnas are usually 24-volt, usually. But let's say you got a 24-volt electrical system. You're going to have a 28-volt alternator. So that alternator, just call it a little bit of headroom. It needs to just put a little bit more power in to keep that battery charged. So the reason it would be called a low voltage is if you got a voltmeter reading voltage, if the alternator is working, it's going to say 28 volts. If the alternator stops working, it's going to say 24 volts. Hence, low voltage. That's where that comes from. And I was flying my Saratoga again just a couple days ago, and just for the heck of it, I reached over, I turned the alternator off. Nothing changed, but on my engine monitor, instead of it reading, that airplane has a 12-volt system, so instead of it reading 14 volts, it went down to 12 volts. It was like 12.2, and it turned red. So that told me that, and I didn't have any other indication. There was no light that said alternator failure or anything like that. Now, a G1000 airplane, you would probably have something that would say alternator failure. So I think as instructors, it's something that's important that we do to go up in the air and say, let's turn the alternator off. Let's see what we get. What does it look like? And again, I would venture to say that turning the battery off too would be good, because it's maybe it's a confidence booster. It says, okay, I know in theory we said in the classroom that we could shut the master switch off in flight and everything would be fine. But boy, I really don't want to do it. But now you go up in the airplane and you do it, and I think everybody kind of goes, oh, okay. The engine really still runs. So
Yeah,
that,
it is a piece of art when you actually experience it, for sure, right? I mean,
absolutely.
It's shocking. I think we all know the magnetos work and how they work, but to believe it because you did it is a whole nother ball game, right? And this isn't something you should be testing at low altitudes or whatever else. Like, go be smart about it. Do it with your instructor. Instructors do it with the chief if you've never done it and you're not confident about it. But, the safest way to do it is just do it on the ground, right? Turn the alternator off on the ground. See what happens. If you have an ammeter, see what happens with the ammeter. If you have a voltmeter, see what happens with the voltmeter. But what's going to be shocking to everybody is not much is going to happen, because not much happens until the battery dies.
Right. And now, we have more and more airplanes that are incorporating electronic ignition. So now even older airplanes can be modified with electronic ignition. Now, how does that change things? Well, if you went out to your car, most of us have, cars that are less than 40 years old, and you eliminated the electrical system from your car, it would stop running. That's the point of electronic ignition. So the part that provides power to the spark plugs is electric. Okay, we need electricity to run our car. Same with electronic ignition. So electronic ignition is much more efficient. It burns fuel better power, easier to start, all kinds of things. But it needs electricity is the downside. So there are some airplanes now that have, and usually the older airplanes, what they'll do is they'll put the electronic ignition on one side. And most of the electronic ignitions have its own internal backup battery, just like if you have maybe a G5 in your airplane. That G5 probably has its own internal battery that stays charged, and in theory, with a total electrical failure, that G5 is going to run for another 4 hours or so. So if you have an airplane that has electronic ignition, you need to know what the situation is. Do I have a backup battery built in to that electronic ignition, or maybe not? Maybe I don't. And when and if that battery dies, I'm going to lose that side of the ignition. So now we're going to be basically operating on one magneto. And can we do that? Well, yeah, we can do that. I mean, is it ideal? No, absolutely not ideal. But we do a mag check every day. We shut off one mag and the engine still runs. We lose probably 5% power, but it still runs.
And in that situation, I think we've talked about this a bazillion times, but it's really up to the pilot to decide whether that's something to declare an emergency or not. You might have two magnetos, and you lose one of those magnetos, and you recognize that problem by testing the magnetos. But I think from all I've learned and from all I've thought, I think I would declare an emergency, because you only have one left. That second magneto quits, you're out. The engine is going to stop. And so
Absolutely.
There's no one that would fault you for declaring an emergency with only one magneto working, because you will have an emergency if that one quits working. And I've heard it from a bunch of people who've had that situation happen. Some have declared an emergency, some haven't. But after the fact, all of them said, I should have declared an emergency. So it's one of those things where you recognize it and you decide it. Some of the stuff I'm working on for this type rating, it's a Vision Jet type rating, is a cap system, and I've never really been around the cap system because I have limited time in a Cirrus aircraft. But their thought process is pull immediately, and there's a number of scenarios where you would pull it immediately no matter what, and then there's a number of times where you would consider pulling. And I think that that thought process and going through training and having someone else give me a different thought process has made it interesting to me to say that those two thought processes are really defining how bad the situation is, right? If you're at 5,000 feet in the daytime in VFR conditions, you probably consider pulling it if your engine stops working in a Cirrus, because you probably have a lot of options or more than one option at 5,000 feet. 1,000 feet at night in the middle of nowhere, maybe some mountains, there's probably not many options left, and it's probably more like a pull immediately thing. But that, again, helps people think through kind of the process by which you might make a decision. I've heard you say it a million times, and I know we've talked about it a million times. If you have an electrical failure, no matter what it is, that's not an immediate put it in the field. Like that's not going to help the situation.
Yeah. There was a point in time doing check rides that I would give a scenario, and I'd say, okay, you're flying from point A to point B. Let's say it's 150 miles. Okay, there's no wind today. It's 150 miles, so a little bit over an hour flight. You're 75 miles away, so you're at exactly the halfway point. And your number two communications radio fails. I'll say, what are you going to do? A, continue. B, turn around and go home. C, divert. D, put it in the field. Thank goodness nobody has ever elected to put it in the field. And it's there's no wrong answer. There is really no wrong answer. Somebody may say, well, I'm going to divert because, I'm thinking maybe there's an underlying problem. Maybe I got an electrical problem. And, well, okay. All right. Maybe not what I would do, but, am I going to continue or am I going to turn around? Well, it just depends. But I think it's a great discussion. It's a Saturday morning donut and coffee at the local airport discussion. What are you going to do? If you've got 8 people in the room, you're going to have, many different opinions on what to do. But it's just to get you thinking about things like that. I'm passionate about electrical system failures, and I'm going to talk about them all the time on check rides. And I will say, okay, if we have an indication of an alternator failure, is it, what are you going to do? Is it an emergency? And I think the best answer is it depends. I mean, it really depends on the weather. I mean, if we're in the clouds, maybe it is an emergency. If it's clear and a beautiful day, maybe it's not an emergency. So, and I may say one thing and you may say something else, and they're both okay.
Yeah, and I think the practicality of my recent training has helped me think about how we continue to help pilots be better, how this show helps pilots be better. And I think we do that by giving some tips and tricks or examples by how they practice and incorporate some of this, right? You've mentioned the turning the master switch off on the ground after the engine's running, maybe turn off the alternator in flight or on the ground to build into that thought process. Tomorrow I have a flight. Hopefully I've earned the respect of my instructor team and I get signed off on my IPC. But on that flight, we are 1,000% committed. We've exchanged information. We're going to do it. We are going to shoot a practice approach. As the forecast says, it's going to be perfectly clear here tomorrow. And in that practice approach, we're both going to only use ForeFlight. The pilot who's under the hood is only going to use ForeFlight. Because we've mentioned that, like, what are you going to do? If I'm at 5,000 feet and I have an electrical failure and I'm in the clouds, we know one thing, 2 things should continue to work. The engine should continue to run, and my iPad, if charged, should continue to operate. And with the Stratus that I use, and she uses a Strat the Century, if her Century and my Stratus are both working, we should have AHARS. And with that AHARS system and a flight plan, I should still continue to be able to navigate. And I'm excited because I've never done it. You've picked on me and others for not doing it, but go practice that with an instructor. If you fly a lot in instrument conditions and you haven't actually gone out and done that, what an opportunity to incorporate that in a lesson with an instructor in your aircraft, the one you fly the most, to be confident that if everything goes wrong, you are able to do it.
Yeah.
What other things would you suggest?
Well, first of all, let's put a disclaimer out here. We're not saying going around and navigate using nothing but ForeFlight as your primary source. But when everything goes bad and that's all you got left, it works because I've done it. Now, it's just like this. I mean, I Bobby comes from a law enforcement background, and I've got other friends in law enforcement. I know when those police officers go to the range that they shoot with their non-dominant hand, and it may not be as they may not hit everything inside the little bitty circle like I'm sure Bobby does, but it's a confidence level to say, you know what, if something really came back, if it was a really bad day, I could do that. So, it's something that we can do. And when I bring it up to people, most people say, well, yeah, I could do that. And then I will say, well, have you ever done that? And they say, no.
Yeah. And I think you talk about pistol practice, and I always thought shooting from the hip was harder than shooting with my left hand, but you don't always get to aim, right? That was kind of the concept. Right. And it's shocking how good a police officer can shoot from the hip because they do it so much. And that's where I think my recent training has been like, wow, I can land without the PFD working, and I can do it with the foggles on. I can do a lot of cool stuff that I hadn't been practicing, so I couldn't do it. And now that I've incorporated it into my practice, I can do it. And I'm not overly confident, but confident going into this type rating that I can pretty much read any approach plate, know the rules that I need to follow, and get there because I've been practicing it. And that's, I think, the biggest tip, right? Challenge yourself, challenge your students. Take an autopilot and kill it before you want to. Use the autopilot more than you normally would. Turn it off later than you normally would. Whatever those things are, like constantly sharpen the edge of your pilot skills and continue to get better. There's enough problems that can occur that you can create 50 scenarios on every flight if you want to become a better student and become a better flight instructor and make better pilots every day. Yeah.
And with that in mind, with the thought of using an iPad to navigate, we need to try to get in the habit of keeping that iPad charged. If you've got an external battery, you probably need to have an external battery in your flight bag. If you've got a USB port on the panel of the airplane, keep that iPad plugged in.
Well, it's also it's this interesting challenge that I seem to do with people, and I asked an instructor I have a friend who's on my podcast named Wally who always talks about this Victor Airway, and I said, hey, if I ever have to ride with Wally again, I want to know how to find and follow this Victor Airway. Can you show me how to load it into the G1000? I'm 3 for 3, and no one's been able to show me how to load the Victor Airway. Now, I have since learned myself how to load a Victor Airway, so you can't give me Wally. But I probably won't track it the way you wanted me to, the way I would load it. So I need to load the VORs and track it with the localizer signals or the VOR signals. But it's really easy to load the Victor Airway in the G1000 if you know how to do it. And I think I've been complacent myself for years where that'd be cool to do, but I don't know how to do it, so that's not going to be part of my quiver. Well, that's a pretty important piece of information if you fly a G1000 all the time to have in your quiver.
Right.
And I think that those sorts of things, those can be challenged on every flight. I had a flight today where the instructor did not know how to put the approach plate on the screen on ForeFlight. And I was like, wow. I guess if you've never been shown it or no one's ever used it next to you, you might go from plate to map, plate to map, plate to map.
Right.
But he saw me put it on my map, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. I get to teach you something. But there's a million things like that to learn. Continue to challenge yourself. Continue to ask the hard questions. I showed him another trick that in ForeFlight, you can actually put the waypoints of an approach in the flight nav log. ForeFlight's designed for this, and get so much more situational awareness to have that redundancy both on the screen and on your leg. Really good stuff. So keep challenging yourselves, keep learning, keep recognizing problems, and create a few on your own with Post-it notes or whatever you can to be better pilots. Anything to add as we close?
No, just, I've really started incorporating this on my check rides. I tell people now, and this just isn't a check ride thing. We can apply this to any flight, but I apply it to check rides. I'll before we go out to fly, I'll say to the applicant, we have 3 goals today. Number 1 goal is to not die. Number 2 goal is to complete a check ride. Number 3 goal is to have some fun. I'll say if we get all 3, it's a great day. If we get 2, it's a good day. If we get 1, at least we live to live another day. And I think we can take that and just take the word check ride and put flight. Okay, we have 3 goals for our flight today. And of course, that number 1 goal, that's what we're going for. We want to, and we can't measure the lives that we save, but I don't know. Maybe we can look at the statistics and say, well, less people got hurt this year than last year. But that's the bottom line. We want to. What we're doing here, if we mess up bad enough, it can hurt. It can hurt.
Yeah, with that, you bring up a good tease for a future show that's coming, probably in a few weeks now. But Paul Craig has finished the 3rd edition of the Killing Zone, got new data, new statistics, new numbers that he's excited to publish and share. As soon as we know the launch date or the release date of the 3rd edition, Paul's going to jump back on the show with us and tell us a number of things that have changed in those numbers and what pilots need to be thinking about. So we look forward to having Paul Craig and a good discussion about the Killing Zone 3rd edition. And hopefully we've continued to get better in GA and all of aviation and have solved some of the problems we've had in the past. With that, as always, fly safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.